The letter in Silas Blackwood's pocket felt thin as a prayer, the paper softened by a month of anxious handling. It promised a woman named Su Yin, described as modest, skilled in household arts, and willing to make a new life in the hardpan dirt of Redemption, Nevada. He had paid the passage, sent the bride price, and now stood on the splintered planks of the train platform, the July sun beating down on his neck. The whistle of the approaching locomotive was a shrill, final sound, the closing of one chapter of his life and, he hoped, the start of another. He had left the gun behind, both the physical colt at his hip and the reputation that came with it. All he wanted was a partner to share the silence of his 160 acres. But the woman who stepped from the train car into the shimmering heat was not modest. She was not Su Yin. She wore denim trousers, scuffed boots, and a plain cotton shirt dusty from travel. Her hair was tied back in a severe, practical knot, and her face, though etched with fatigue, held a defiant stillness. She carried a single, heavy-looking trunk, which she set down with a solid thud. Her eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the small crowd of onlookers, passed over the mayor and the land agent, and settled on Silas. He knew it was him she was looking for. He was the only man standing alone, holding a single, wilting prairie rose. He had thought it a fine gesture. Now, under her gaze, it felt foolish. She walked directly toward him, her steps even and deliberate, ignoring the murmurs that rippled through the onlookers. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze dropping to the sad flower in his hand, then rising back to his face. She was not small. She was not gentle. She looked as though she had been forged from the same hard earth he was trying to tame. "You are Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice was lower than he expected, and clear, with an accent that clipped the edges of the words. He could only nod, his throat suddenly dry. The entire town of Redemption seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next line in a play they had not paid to see. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, amplifying the silence. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod of her own, a confirmation. "I am Lynn," she said, as if the name itself were a heavy stone she was setting between them. Then came the words that shattered the stale, hot air. "You bought the wrong bride." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer expectant, it was sharp, hungry. Silas could feel the eyes of Jasper Thorne, the town's unofficial ruler, boring into his back. He could hear the faint snicker from a couple of ranch hands loafing near the stationmaster's office. Humiliation was a currency in towns like this, and his account was about to be overdrawn. He was supposed to be the quiet homesteader, the man who kept to himself. Now he was the fool on the platform, the man who had ordered a wife like a piece of machinery, only to have the wrong part delivered. He looked at Lynn, at the unyielding set of her jaw, the exhaustion she refused to show in her posture. She was facing him down, giving him the chance to reject her publicly, to send her back on the next train east and be done with it. It was what any sensible man would do. But Silas Blackwood had rarely been a sensible man. He looked at her steady eyes, and in them he saw not an insult, but a challenge. He saw a flicker of something he recognized, the grim determination of a survivor. He let the withered rose fall from his fingers. Then, slowly, he smiled and held out his hand. The gesture hung in the air between them, a bridge over a chasm of misunderstanding. Lynn's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for the trick, the mockery she clearly expected. The onlookers shifted, their collective disappointment a palpable thing. This was not the explosion of anger they had craved. Silas didn't retract his hand. He simply held it there, palm up, calloused from labor, not from the smooth grip of a pistol anymore. "The trunk looks heavy," he said, his voice steady. "Let me help you with it." For a long moment, she just stared at his outstretched hand. The town wanted a scene, a rejection, a loud confirmation of their prejudices. Silas was offering something else entirely. He was offering a quiet acceptance of the reality standing before him, not the fantasy from the letter. He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, quickly masked. She had come prepared for a fight, for scorn, for dismissal. She had not come prepared for a simple, quiet courtesy. Finally, with a reluctance that was almost physically visible, she gave a stiff nod and allowed him to take one handle of the heavy trunk. The moment their hands were on the same object, a silent pact was formed. The show was over. The crowd began to disperse, grumbling, their lunchtime entertainment cut short. Jasper Thorne gave Silas a look of cold amusement before turning away, a look that promised this was not the end of it. Silas ignored him. He and Lynn lifted the trunk together and began the slow walk toward the wagon, leaving the train station and its judgments behind them. The ride out to his claim was mostly silent, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the two sturdy mules. The sun baked the landscape into a uniform shade of dusty brown, broken only by the gray-green of sagebrush. Silas pointed out landmarks, not to make conversation, but to fill the quiet. "That's Miller's Ridge. We follow this dry creek bed another 2 miles." Lynn said nothing, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her hands resting in her lap, folded but not relaxed. He could feel her watching him from the corner of her eye, still measuring him. He had bought the wrong bride, she had said. But as the miles passed, a different thought began to form in his mind. Looking at her resolute profile, the capable set of her shoulders, he wondered if maybe, for the first time in his life, he had accidentally done the right thing. His homestead was not a place for a delicate flower. It was a place that broke people. He needed a partner, not a porcelain doll. He had asked for one, and the universe, in its own cruel and mysterious way, might have sent him the other. His property came into view as they rounded a cluster of rock formations. It was not much to look at. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built himself from pine logs, a half-finished corral, and a barn that was little more than a lean-to against a bluff. A well with a hand pump stood near the cabin. It was a place of beginnings, stark and unforgiving. He saw Lynn's eyes take it all in, her expression unreadable. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the cabin and set the brake. "This is it," he said, the word sounding inadequate. "It's not much yet. But the land is good. There's water." He waited for her disappointment, for the accusation that he had misrepresented himself. The letter he'd sent had spoken of potential, of a future, but the present was a hard, lonely reality. Lynn was quiet for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over the raw land, the endless sky. "It is honest land," she said finally, and the simple assessment held more weight than 100 pleasantries. She slid down from the wagon seat before he could offer a hand, landing lightly on her feet. She walked to the well, worked the pump handle until water gushed out, and cupped her hands to drink. She was testing the single most important thing on the property. Silas watched her, a knot of tension he hadn't realized he was holding beginning to loosen in his chest. She understood. They carried her trunk inside. The cabin was a single room, clean and spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few books, tin plates, and sacks of flour and beans. It was a bachelor's existence, stripped to the essentials. He had intended to build another room for Su Yin, to give her privacy. Now, with Lynn standing in the middle of the floor, the small space felt charged, impossibly close. "You can have the bed," he said quickly. "I'll sleep in the barn until I can add on." Lynn looked from the bed to him, her expression guarded. "I did not come here to take a man's bed," she stated flatly. "I came to work. Your letter to my sister promised passage and $500. I will work to pay back the passage. Then I will work to earn the $500. Then I will be on my way." So that was the arrangement she had decided on. She was not a bride, but an indentured servant by her own decree. It was a clean, transactional proposal. It was also an insult, though he knew she didn't mean it as one. She was drawing a line, making it clear she was not his property. The letter was for a wife, Silas said, keeping his voice even. A partner. The money was a bridal gift, not a wage. "The wife you wrote for is not here," Lynn countered, her chin lifting. "I am. And I will not be a wife to any man. I will work." Before he could argue, a loud crack echoed from the direction of the corral, followed by the panicked whinnying of his horse, Bess. Silas swore and ran outside, Lynn right behind him. The top rail of the half-finished corral had splintered and fallen, spooking the mare. She was now circling the enclosure, wild-eyed, looking for a way to bolt into the open country where he might never find her. "Easy, girl, easy," Silas said, approaching slowly, his hands out. But the horse was too frightened, shying away from him violently. She was about to try and jump the lower rails, a sure way to break a leg. He was calculating the risk of trying to rope her when Lynn moved past him. She didn't run. She walked in a low crouch, speaking in a soft, crooning tone in her own language. The sound was like flowing water, melodic and calm. Bess's ears twitched. Her panicked circling slowed. Lynn kept up the steady, quiet sound, moving not directly at the horse, but in a slow, deliberate arc, guiding her away from the broken section of fence and toward the corner. Within a minute, the mare had calmed, her sides still heaving but her eyes no longer frantic. Lynn reached out and ran a hand down the horse's neck, her touch firm and confident. Bess leaned into it. Silas stood, stunned, watching a woman he'd met 2 hours ago gentle his horse more effectively than he ever could. She turned to him. "Your rails are too dry," she said, her voice back to its crisp, businesslike tone. "They will keep splitting. You need to treat the wood." She looked from the broken fence to the vast, empty land around them, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than defiance crossed her face. It might have been exhaustion, or it might have been the crushing realization of just how much work there was to be done. He had advertised for a wife. What he got was a horse whisperer and a carpenter. Maybe, he thought again, his luck was finally turning. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the unending list of chores. Silas rose before dawn to tend the small vegetable patch and check the fences, while Lynn, who seemed to require as little sleep as a coyote, would already be up, a small fire going in the hearth, coffee brewing. She was a tireless worker. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of labor, whether she was mucking out the barn, treating the new pine rails for the corral, or helping Silas clear rocks from a field he hoped to one day plant with wheat. She rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but her silence was not empty. It was observant. She noticed things, the way a hawk circles its prey. She noticed the way he favored his left leg when he was tired, the lingering trace of an old injury. She noticed which of the chickens was the best layer. And he noticed her. He noticed the calluses on her hands were old and deep, not new. He noticed that while she dressed and worked like a ranch hand, she kept a small, intricately carved wooden bird by her bedroll, an object of delicate beauty that seemed completely at odds with her practical nature. They were two strangers sharing a small patch of dirt, bound by a contract one of them refused to acknowledge and the other was beginning to hope would change. A week after her arrival, their supplies ran low. The trip to Redemption was unavoidable. Silas loaded the wagon, his gut tightening at the prospect. The town had not forgotten his arrival with Lynn. He had felt their judgment like a physical presence every time he'd gone in for the mail. This time, Lynn would be with him. "You can stay here if you'd rather," he offered, not wanting to subject her to the stares and whispers. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "The flour is for my bread, too," she said, and climbed onto the wagon seat without another word. It was her way of saying they were in this together, whether he liked it or not. The town was just as he expected. As they drove down the main street, conversation stopped. People turned to stare. The looks were a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and outright hostility. Lynn kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her back rigid. Silas felt a slow burn of anger. He had spent years trying to become invisible, and this woman, in 1 week, had made him the most visible man in the county. Their first stop was the general store, owned by Jasper Thorne. Thorne was a man who had prospered by lending money at ruinous rates and acquiring land when the owners defaulted. He controlled the town's small bank, held the mortgage on half the businesses, and had long coveted Silas's claim because of its reliable well. Thorne was behind the counter, polishing a glass. He smiled when they entered, a wide, predatory smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Good to see you. And you've brought your companion." He let the word hang in the air, thick with insinuation. "Lynn," Silas said, his voice flat. This is Jasper Thorne. He owns the store. Lynn gave Thorne a brief, dismissive nod and turned her attention to a sack of beans, testing its weight. Thorne's smile tightened. He was not used to being dismissed, especially not by a woman, and certainly not by a Chinese woman. A man of your history, Blackwood, Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. I'd have thought you'd have better sense than to get tangled up in something so complicated. People talk. It's not good for a man trying to establish himself. It was a threat, wrapped in the guise of friendly advice. He was reminding Silas of his past, of the reputation he was trying to escape, and warning him that the town's goodwill was conditional. I need flour, salt, and 10 pounds of coffee beans, Silas said, ignoring the bait. He placed his list on the counter. Thorne glanced at it, then back at Lynn, who was now examining the quality of a bolt of canvas. Quite the worker, is she? Thorne asked, his voice slick with meaning. I hear the railroad pays a fair wage for that kind of labor. Perhaps she'd be happier in a place with more of her own kind. The thinly veiled racism was meant to provoke, to drive a wedge. Silas felt his hand clench. The old instincts, the ones that solved problems with speed and violence, stirred in him. But he looked at Lynn, who still hadn't given Thorne the satisfaction of a reaction. She was acting as if he wasn't even there. Taking his cue from her, Silas took a deep breath. Just the supplies, Thorne, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Unless you're out of stock. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He had expected a reaction, an argument, a display of anger he could use against Silas later. The quiet refusal to engage seemed to unnerve him more than any threat. He silently gathered their goods, his movements stiff and angry. As he tallied the bill, he leaned in close. That land of yours has a good well, Blackwood. A man with troubles finds it hard to hold onto good land. Things happen. Accidents. They loaded the supplies in silence, the tension from the store clinging to them like dust. As they were about to climb onto the wagon, 2 of Thorne's ranch hands, the same ones who had been loitering at the train station, swaggered over. They were both large men, smelling of whiskey despite the early hour. Well now, the first one said, planting himself in front of Lynn. Look what Blackwood dragged in. You speak English, girl? Lynn's jaw tightened, but she didn't reply. She simply tried to step around him. He blocked her path. I asked you a question, he sneered. My friend asked you a question, the second one added, moving to stand behind Silas, boxing them in. Silas felt the world slow down, the way it always did before trouble. He could see the other townsfolk watching from the doorways and windows, their faces a mixture of fear and eager anticipation. This was the scene they had been waiting for. Let us pass, boys, Silas said, his voice low and even. We're done here. We ain't done, the first man said, reaching out to grab Lynn's arm. We're just getting friendly. In that instant, 2 things happened at once. Silas moved, grabbing the man's wrist with a grip of iron, twisting it until the man cried out in pain. At the same moment, Lynn, who had seemed frozen, moved with startling speed. She dropped her weight, pivoted on the ball of her foot, and slammed the heel of her boot into the man's kneecap. There was a sickening crunch, and he howled, collapsing to the ground. The second man, stunned by the sudden turn of events, gaped at his fallen partner. That hesitation cost him. Silas released the first man and stepped forward, not with a fist, but with an open palm that struck the second man's chest, a hard, jolting blow that knocked the wind out of him and sent him staggering backward into a horse trough. He came up sputtering, soaked and humiliated. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. The street was dead silent. Lynn stood, breathing a little heavily, her eyes blazing with a fire Silas had not seen before. She looked at the man clutching his shattered knee on the ground, her expression one of cold fury. Silas stood over the man in the trough, his shadow falling across him. He hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't thrown a punch. But the message was clear. The town of Redemption had just been reminded of who Silas Blackwood used to be. He turned to Lynn. "Get in the wagon," he said, his voice tight. She did, her movements fluid and quick. Silas climbed up beside her and took the reins. He didn't look at Thorn, who was now standing in the doorway of his store, his face a mask of fury. He didn't look at the stunned townspeople. He just slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the mess and the whispers behind. They didn't speak for the first few miles. The silence in the wagon was thick with the aftermath of violence. The dry creek bed seemed dustier, the sun harsher. Finally, Silas broke the quiet. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes on the mules. "His knee will heal," she said, her voice clipped. It wasn't the answer to the question he had asked. He glanced at her. Her hands were clenched into tight fists in her lap. She was trembling, a fine, barely controlled tremor. "Lynn," he said, more gently this time. "I asked if you are all right." She turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw a crack in her armor. He saw fear, not for herself, but a deep, weary anger at the world's ugliness. "They look at me like I am a dog," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage. "Worse than a dog. They think because I am Chinese, I am not a person. They think they can touch me." Silas had no words to answer that, because it was the truth. He had seen that look in 100 towns across the territory. "What you did," he said instead, thinking of her swift, brutal efficiency. "Where did you learn to do that?" She looked away, toward the barren hills. "Where I come from, a woman learns to be fast, or she does not survive." The answer was an evasion, but it told him more than a direct confession would have. Her past was not one of household arts and modest obedience. It was a past that taught a person how to break a man's knee. The rest of the drive passed in that heavy silence. When they got back to the homestead, they unloaded the supplies with a grim purposefulness. The shared violence had changed something between them. It had forged a new, unwelcome kind of intimacy. That night, after a supper of beans and bread that neither of them tasted, Silas went to the barn. He found her trunk tucked away in a corner, covered with a spare blanket. He hadn't touched it since they brought it in. But Thorn's threats, and the raw fury in Lynn's eyes, had planted a seed of unease in him. He knew he was crossing a line. He knew it was a violation of the fragile trust they were building. But he had to know what she was running from. He lifted the lid. Inside, beneath neatly folded clothes, was a small, lacquered box. He opened it. There was no wanted poster. There was no weapon. There was only a stack of letters, tied with a ribbon, and a photograph. It was a daguerreotype of 2 young women. One was Lynn, younger, her face softer but still serious. The other was a girl who looked like a more delicate, more fragile version of her. She was the one who matched the description in the letters. She was Su Yin. Tucked beneath the photograph was a document, a piece of paper with elegant script. It wasn't in English. But Silas recognized the format. It was a contract of debt, and at the bottom was a name stamped in red ink, a man named Chen from San Francisco. The next morning, the air was still and cool. The fight in town felt like a fever dream. Silas waited until they had finished their coffee, the silence stretching between them. He walked over to the trunk, retrieved the lacquered box, and set it on the table between them. He didn't open it. He just looked at Lynn. Her face went pale. The composure she wore like armor dissolved, leaving her looking young and vulnerable. She stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No," he agreed, his own voice rough with regret. "I didn't. But after yesterday, I had to understand. Thorn won't stop. He'll use whatever he can to run us off this land. And to do that, he'll use you. I need to know what I'm fighting." He pushed the box gently toward her. She didn't move for a long time. Then, with trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon around the letters. She didn't read them. She didn't need to. "Her name is Su Yin," she said, her voice barely audible. "She is my sister." She spoke for nearly an hour, the words pouring out of her as if a dam had broken. Their parents had died of a fever in a railroad camp in the Sierras. Lynn, the elder by 2 years, had raised her sister. She had worked washing laundry, cooking, doing whatever it took to keep them fed and safe. But Su-yin was beautiful and gentle, and her beauty attracted the wrong kind of attention. A year ago, a fire had destroyed the laundry where Lin worked. They were left with nothing. To survive the winter, Lin had borrowed money from Mr. Chen, a powerful man in San Francisco's Chinatown who presented himself as a benevolent community leader but was in reality a ruthless moneylender. The debt grew with impossible interest, and when Lin couldn't pay, Chen made a new offer. He would forgive the debt in exchange for Su-yin. Not as a wife, but as a housemaid in one of his establishments, a gilded cage from which she would never emerge. The arranged marriage with Silas was Su-yin's only escape. Lin had scraped together the money to answer his advertisement and arrange the passage, seeing it as a lifeline. But when the time came to leave, Su-yin was paralyzed by fear. She was terrified of the journey, terrified of the strange man waiting for her, terrified of leaving the only world she knew, however dangerous. So Lin had come instead. I was to send her the bride price, the $500, Lin finished, her voice hollow. It would have been enough to pay Chen, to buy her freedom. I came to work for it. That is all. Silas looked at the strong, capable woman before him, and the pieces clicked into place. She wasn't an imposter. She was a protector. She had thrown herself into the path of danger to save her sister. The money, he said slowly. I sent it 2 months ago. To the address in the letter. Lin looked up, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. I never received it, she whispered. The man who arranged the letters, Mr. Fong, he must have kept it. The silence in the cabin was absolute. The $500 was gone. Su-yin was still in San Francisco, and Mr. Chen's patience would be at an end. Lin had walked into one trap trying to escape another. 3 days later, they came. Silas had been watching the horizon since Lin told him her story, a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He saw the dust cloud first, 2 riders coming fast from the west, not from the direction of town. They weren't Thorne's men. They were dressed in dark, city-style clothes that looked out of place in the Nevada dust, and they rode with a grim, purposeful air. Lin was by the well when she saw them. She froze, the bucket slipping from her hand and clattering against the stones. The color drained from her face. It is them, she said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. Chen's men. Silas moved quickly. Lin, get in the cabin. Bar the door. And take this. He pushed his spare rifle into her hands, a heavy Winchester. You know how to use it. She nodded, her eyes huge and dark. I do. Good, he said. Don't come out. No matter what you hear. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked toward the front of the cabin, positioning himself so the woodpile offered a little cover. He didn't draw his gun. Not yet. The time for that might come, but he would not be the one to start it. The 2 men reined in their horses about 30 yards away. They were both Chinese, their faces hard and impassive. One was older, with a long, thin scar down his cheek. The other was younger, but his eyes were just as cold. The older one dismounted, his movements fluid. We are looking for a woman, he said, his English precise. She calls herself Lin. She is a thief. There's no thief here, Silas said, his voice calm and steady. You're on private property. I suggest you move on. The man smiled, a humorless stretching of his thin lips. Mr. Chen is a patient man, but his patience has limits. The girl was to pay a debt. Instead, she ran. She stole from him. She stole nothing, Silas said. The money for her sister's debt was stolen by another man. A convenient story, the man said with a shrug. It does not matter. The arrangement has changed. Mr. Chen no longer wants the money. He wants the girl. As a lesson to others who might think of defying him, he took a step forward. Give her to us, and we will leave you to your dirt farm. Refuse, and we will burn it to the ground with you in it. This was the moment. The choice he had been trying to outrun his whole life. He could give her up. He could hand her over and go back to his quiet, lonely existence. It was the sensible thing to do. No one would blame him. But he looked past the man, at the cabin door, behind which Lynn was holding a rifle, waiting. He thought of her telling him, "I will work." He thought of her gentling his horse. He thought of the way she had stood up to Thorne's thugs. She was not a possession to be handed over. She was his partner. He had offered her his hand at the station, a simple courtesy. Now, he had to offer her his life. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said, his voice dropping low. The man's smile vanished. A poor choice. He made a slight gesture with his hand. The younger man on the horse reached for his gun. He never cleared the leather. Silas's draw was a blur of motion, an instinct honed over years of violent survival. The Colt seemed to leap into his hand. The shot was a single, deafening crack that echoed off the bluffs. The younger man grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and toppled sideways from his horse. The older man, impossibly fast, had drawn his own pistol and fired. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Silas's shoulder, a hot, searing pain that spun him around. He gritted his teeth, brought his own gun back into line, and fired again. The second shot caught the older man in the chest. He staggered back, his eyes wide, and fell. Silence descended, thick and ringing. Smoke curled from the barrel of Silas's Colt. The pain in his shoulder was a roaring fire. He leaned against the woodpile, breathing heavily, the world starting to go grey at the edges. The cabin door flew open and Lynn ran out, the Winchester held at the ready. She took in the scene in a glance, the two bodies on the ground, Silas slumped against the wood, blood soaking his shirt. She ran to him, her face a mask of terror and determination. "You are hit," she said, tearing a strip from her shirt. "It is bad, just a scratch," he lied, his voice weak. He looked at the two dead men, then at her. "They'll send more," he said. "Chen won't let this go. Then we will be ready," she said, pressing the makeshift bandage against his wound. Her hands were firm, her eyes clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. In that moment, looking at her fierce, protective face, Silas Blackwood knew he had not bought the wrong bride. He had found the only one who could have possibly survived him. 6 months later, the first snow of winter was dusting the high peaks of Miller's Ridge. The homestead was transformed. The corral was finished, its rails straight and strong. A new room had been added to the cabin, and a sturdy stone chimney had replaced the old mud and wattle one. The barn was no longer a lean-to but a proper structure, sheltering Bess and a new mule. Silas's shoulder had healed into a puckered scar, a permanent reminder of the day his past and future collided. He and Lynn had worked side by side, driven by the knowledge that their peace was fragile. They had buried Chen's men in an unmarked grave far from the homestead, a secret the land now kept for them. Silas had used the last of his old connections, sending a single telegraph message to a former U.S. Marshal he knew in San Francisco. The message was simple: leave Blackwood's claim in Nevada alone. It is protected. He never received a reply, but no more riders came. The threat from Chen had receded into a watchful silence, a sleeping dragon that might one day wake, but for now, they were safe. The town of Redemption had changed, too. After the gunfight, the story of what happened had twisted and grown in the telling. Silas Blackwood was no longer just a quiet homesteader, he was the gunslinger who had single-handedly killed 2 professional enforcers to protect his property and his woman. Fear, Silas knew, was a more effective fence than wood or wire. Jasper Thorne still owned the town, but he no longer looked at Silas with contempt. He looked at him with a grudging, cautious respect. Thorne's men gave their homestead a wide berth. When Silas and Lynn went to town for supplies now, the whispers were different. They were no longer whispers of scorn, but of awe. The townspeople still stared, but not because Lynn was Chinese. They stared because she was the woman who stood with Silas Blackwood. They had become a local legend, a mystery the town could not solve. They were simply the Blackwoods of Miller's Ridge, a fact as solid and unyielding as the landscape itself. They had forged a partnership in silence, in shared labor, and in violence. They were not husband and wife in the eyes of the law, but they were bound by something stronger. One crisp December evening, as Lynn banked the fire for the night, Silas placed a document on the rough-hewn table. It was a legal deed, drawn up by the territorial clerk in the county seat 100 miles away. It registered the 160 acres of the homestead under two names, Silas Blackwood and Lynn. Not Lynn Blackwood. Just Lynn. He had made sure of that. She picked it up, her movement slow, and read it. Her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the fire, was still. She read it twice, as if to be sure of the words. When she looked up at him, her dark eyes were shining with a light he had never seen before. "This makes me your partner," she said, her voice quiet. "Legally it always was yours," he said. "This just makes it so no man can ever take it from you." He thought back to that first day at the train station, the blistering heat, the foolish Rose, the hostile crowd. He remembered holding out his hand, an impulsive gesture of defiance against the town's judgment. Now, he held out his hand again, here in the quiet of the home they had built together. It was not an offer of help or of pity. It was an offer of everything he was, and everything he had. "Lynn," he said, and her name felt right in his mouth for the first time. "I know I am not the man you would have chosen. You are the man who stood," she answered, her voice soft but sure. She did not take his hand. Instead, she stepped forward and laid her own hand, calloused and strong, against the side of his face. It was the first time she had willingly touched him. In her touch, he felt not the end of a debt, but the beginning of a life. The silence in the cabin was no longer heavy or watchful. It was peaceful. It was home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.